The back wall was floor to ceiling, rows and rows of small plastic packages hung from metal hooks. Resistors in little tan packages, capacitors, diodes, toggle switches, LED bulbs in red, green, and yellow. Every package cost 49 cents, $1.29, or $2.99. And the guy behind the counter knew what every single one of them did. You did not have to explain what you were building. You walked in with a dead circuit board from your dad's stereo, and he looked at it for 10 seconds and pointed at the wall. A 470 ohm resistor, a 100 microfarad capacitor. He did not look it up. He did not check a computer. He just knew, because that is who worked at RadioShack in 1978. Retired engineers, ham radio operators, guys who had been building amplifiers in their garages since the Kennedy administration. Someone walked into a boardroom and decided that wall was worth less than a Sprint phone contract. That person had never touched a soldering iron in his life. But that comes later. First, you need to understand how a leather company from Fort Worth, Texas, built the most important electronics store this country ever had. In 1921, two brothers named Theodore and Milton Deutschmann opened a mail-order shop in downtown Boston. They sold vacuum tubes, crystals, and antenna wire to amateur radio operators. They called it RadioShack, after the small wooden cabin on a ship's deck where the radio operator worked. Every Navy vessel had one. The RadioShack was the only way a ship could talk to the rest of the world. The company grew slowly through the 20s and 30s. By the early 60s, it was dying. They had 9 stores around Boston and $800,000 in debt. They were basically bankrupt. Then a man from Fort Worth showed up. Charles Tandy came from a family that had been in the leather business since 1919. His father sold shoe parts to cobblers. Charles went to Texas Christian University, served in the Navy, came home and started mailing leather hobby kits to schools and military bases. He was loud and relentless, and he could sell anything to anyone. He had a saying he repeated to anyone who would listen: "If you want to catch a mouse, you have to make a noise like a cheese." Nobody was entirely sure what it meant, but everything he touched turned profitable. In 1963, Tandy Corporation bought RadioShack for roughly $300,000. 9 stores were near bankruptcy. Within 2 years, he had it making money. His strategy was simple, and it was brutal. Kill every outside brand. No more selling someone else's products at someone else's markup. RadioShack would manufacture its own. They put the realistic name on stereos, Archer on cables, Optimus on speakers, and Enercell on batteries. Everything was built to RadioShack specifications, sold only at RadioShack at 50% margins or higher because there was no middleman. You could not buy a realistic receiver anywhere else on earth. You had to walk into that store. Then he did something that made every manager in every store actually care whether you found what you needed. He made them part owners. If you ran a RadioShack, you put your own money in. Your bonus came from your store's performance. You ran it like it was yours because it was. That's why the guy behind the counter knew the difference between a 470 ohm resistor and a 560 ohm resistor. His mortgage depended on it. Every RadioShack had the same smell: hot solder and warm plastic. They had shag carpet, pegboard walls, and a catalog the size of a phone book sitting on the counter. Some men kept stacks of those catalogs in their garages going back 20 years. It was the Sears wish book for people who owned a soldering iron. Every month, you could walk in and get a free battery, the Battery of the Month Club. One battery No purchase necessary, just sign the little card. Tandy had designed it to get you through the door 12 times a year, and it cost him almost nothing. Every time you walked in for that free battery, you walked past the component wall. You walked past the kits. You walked past whatever new thing they had on the shelf that month. That's how RadioShack kept you coming back. RadioShack didn't trap you with a phone contract or a hard sell. They just gave you a free battery, and the guy behind the counter treated you like a regular. If you ever walked in just for the free battery and left with something you didn't plan to buy, tell me what it was. And then there were the kits. The science fair electronic project kits were the greatest educational toy this country ever produced. A wooden board with metal spring connectors and a paper manual full of wiring diagrams. You clipped wires into the springs, followed the diagram, and you could build a working AM radio, a burglar alarm, or a siren. The one that mattered most was the crystal radio. It didn't use batteries or plug into the wall. Just a coil of wire, a germanium diode, and an earpiece. You clipped the antenna lead to a curtain rod, put the earpiece in, and you heard a voice, an actual human voice coming out of a device you built with your own hands from parts that had no power. It felt like a magic trick. Radio waves were floating through the room, through the walls, through everything, all the time. And you just caught one with 20 cents worth of wire and a crystal. More American engineers started at that moment than in any classroom in this country. If you built a crystal radio on your bedroom floor and heard that first voice come through, drop the year in the comments. I want to know how old you were. There was a man named Forrest Mims who wrote little notebooks for RadioShack, hand-printed circuit diagrams, and explanations of how electronics worked. They cost a couple of dollars. Engineers who went on to design satellites and microprocessors say those notebooks taught them more than 4 years of college. If you still have one of those Forrest Mims notebooks somewhere in your house, you know exactly what I'm talking about. By the mid-70s, RadioShack was the biggest electronics retailer in the country, and Tandy built a headquarters to match. Tandy Towers in Fort Worth was an 18-story building with a shopping mall, an indoor ice rink, and its own private subway. It had an actual underground rail system that connected the tower to the company's warehouse complex across the Trinity River. A leather company from Texas had built its own subway. Then Tandy let two guys in his building change the world. In 1976, a RadioShack buyer named Don French had been watching the homebrew computer scene out in California. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak were tinkering in a garage. French convinced Tandy there was a real market for a computer that regular people could buy and use. They hired a 24-year-old engineer named Steve Lininger. He was a member of the same homebrew computer club as Jobs and Wozniak. On August 3, 1977, they unveiled the TRS-80 at a press conference at the Warwick Hotel in Manhattan, $599 with a monitor. That same year, Apple II came out at $1,298. The TRS-80 was half the price, and it was the only one you could buy in a store that already existed in your town. The executives expected to sell 3,000 a year. They sold 10,000 the first month. The phone lines at headquarters crashed. People were calling from living rooms, from kitchens, from payphones outside department stores. They wanted the machine. By the end of the year, over 100,000 units had shipped. That was half of every personal computer sold in America in 1978. Half. If you learned to type your first line of BASIC on a TRS-80 keyboard, you were part of something that changed this country. It had a cheap keyboard and a flickering screen, and the cassette storage would lose your work if you looked at it wrong. People called it the Trash 80, and it put more Americans in front of a computer for the first time than anything Apple made that decade. 4 months after the TRS-80 shipped, Charles Tandy died in his sleep on November 4th, 1978, of a heart attack. He was 60 years old. His lifelong friend Philip North took over as interim and introduced himself to the company with one sentence. All I know about electronics is that the funny end of the battery goes into the flashlight first. Tandy left behind over 8,000 stores in 25 countries, a headquarters with its own subway, a computer that outsold Apple 3-1, and a generation of store managers and clerks and engineers who knew their customers by name, knew what project they were working on, and kept parts behind the counter for the regulars. Some of those regulars were 9 years old. Their dads brought them in on Saturday mornings. They did not realize until 30 years later that those were the best mornings of their childhood. If your dad took you to RadioShack, tell me what he bought. I bet you still remember. What happened to that company started with a decision that looked brilliant on a spreadsheet and killed everything Charles Tandy built. In 1993, 15 years after Tandy died, the board made a choice. The personal computer market had gotten ugly. IBM and Dell and Compaq were in a price war, and Tandy could not keep up. So they sold off the computer manufacturing operations to a company called AST Research for $175 million. 3 factories in Fort Worth, 1 in Scotland, over 2,000 employees walked out the door. The company that had built its empire on making its own products at 50% margins decided it would rather be a middleman selling someone else's. That was the beginning of the end, but it took a long time for anyone to notice. The real killing blow came 20 years later, and it smelled like a cell phone kiosk. By the late 90s, the component wall had started shrinking. First, they shrunk the parts wall down to a corner. Then it became just a single rack, and eventually you had to order the stuff out of a catalog. The science fair kits disappeared. The realistic brand was killed off, replaced by names you could buy at any big box store. And the guy behind the counter who knew what a capacitor did got replaced by a kid in a polo shirt with a sales quota. If you remember the exact moment you walked into a RadioShack and realized it wasn't your store anymore, put it in the comments. What year was it for you? RadioShack had been collecting your name and address at the register for decades. You walk in to buy a $3 pack of batteries, and a teenager asks for your phone number. You're buying a 9-volt, and they want your zip code. Cashiers had quotas for how many names they collected. Missing those quotas was a fireable offense. Customers hated it. It was the single most despised policy the company ever had. You remember standing at that counter with a $2 cable in your hand while some kid asked for your home address like you were signing a lease. If that memory just hit you square in the chest, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. That policy ran until 2004. By then, RadioShack had personal data on tens of millions of Americans, names, home addresses, phone numbers, and a complete record of everything they had ever bought. They stored all of it. That data would matter later in a way that nobody standing at that register ever imagined. In May of 2005, a man named David Edmondson became chief executive officer. He lasted 9 months. On February 20th, 2006, he resigned after it came out that he had fabricated his academic credentials on his resume. The company was in a crisis, and the man running it had faked his degree. Julian Day replaced him in July of 2006. Day had a plan, and the plan was Sprint. RadioShack had renewed an 11-year dealer agreement with Sprint. By 2007, wireless revenue made up more than half of the company's mobile sales and over 15% of total revenue. The commission on a single Sprint phone activation was worth more than everything on that corner rack of resistors sold in a month. So the resistors lost. The store still had the red and white sign out front. The carpet was still there, a little more worn down, but the pegboard walls were bare. The hooks were empty. The little tan packages were gone. In their place was a wall of cell phones under fluorescent light and a poster asking if you wanted unlimited minutes for $39.99. Then the phone companies figured out they didn't need RadioShack anymore. In 2007, Apple launched the iPhone. Every product RadioShack sold as a standalone, like cameras, GPS units, calculators, MP3 players, and voice recorders, became a free app. The store was full of things that a single device had made worthless, and the carriers who had been paying RadioShack commissions started opening their own retail stores. Why split the money with a middleman when you can sell the phone yourself? RadioShack had bet everything on selling the one product that made the rest of its inventory obsolete. On August 4th, 2009, RadioShack told America to call them The Shack. Millions spent on the rebrand. It landed like a dad trying to use his teenager's slang at the dinner table. They bought a Super Bowl ad on February 2nd, 2014. The 80s called, and they wanted their store back. Hulk Hogan walked in. Alf walked in. The ad won awards. The stock ticked up for a week. But you cannot buy a Super Bowl ad to fix a business model that treats loyal customers like data farms. $400 million in losses in 2014 alone. 11 straight quarters of bleeding cash. On February 5th, 2015, RadioShack filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. $1.2 billion in assets against $1.38 billion in debt. After 94 years, the store that taught America how electricity works could not keep its own lights on. Here is where it gets personal. A hedge fund called Standard General bought what was left in May of 2015. They got the brand name, the store leases, and one other thing: the personal records of 67 million RadioShack customers. Names, home addresses, phone numbers, and a complete purchase history for every one of them. Every piece of data that a cashier had collected at that register, because their job depended on it. 20 years of personal information gathered from people who just wanted to buy a battery without an interrogation. Standard General paid $26.2 million for all of it. State attorneys general filed objections. Privacy groups protested. The sale went through anyway. Every time you handed over your zip code to buy a 9-volt battery, you were building an asset, not for yourself. For the people who would auction your information off in bankruptcy court 2 decades later. The sale was entirely legal. That is what makes it sting. If you remember being asked for your phone number just to buy a battery, share this with someone who hated that counter as much as you did. If that makes you angry, hit subscribe. The story of what happened to the stores you grew up in is the same story as what happened to you, and we are going to keep telling it. Standard General took about 1,740 RadioShack locations and turned them into Sprint stores inside RadioShack locations, operating under a name called General Wireless. The employees who once helped you match a resistor to a circuit diagram were now required to push Sprint contracts on anyone who walked through the door. The handful of loyal customers who came in for a pack of AA batteries got a sales pitch instead of a greeting. The stores were filled with cheap drones and knockoff phone cases. The science fair kits were just gone. It lasted 2 years. In March of 2017, General Wireless filed for bankruptcy, second time in 2 years. The remaining stores closed. A company that had once been valued in the billions was worth the price of its signage. Between 2017 and 2020, RadioShack existed as a memory and not much else. A few franchise owners in small towns kept the sign lit. The corporate body was gone. In 2020, a company called Retail E-Commerce Ventures acquired the brand. The company was run by Ty Lopez and Alex Mayer, internet marketers known for buying the names of dead retailers and claiming they could bring them back online. In December of 2021, RadioShack's official accounts announced a pivot to cryptocurrency. They launched something called the Radio Token. The website that had once sold the first mass-market personal computer in American history was now hosting a crypto trading site. The social media accounts started posting things that would have made Charles Tandy leave the room. According to a civil complaint filed by the Securities and Exchange Commission on September 23, 2025, Lopez, Mayer, and their chief operating officer raised approximately $112 million from hundreds of investors between April of 2020 and November of 2022. The SEC alleges that none of the retail brands under their management generated any profit. The complaint states that at least $5.9 million in returns paid to early investors came directly from money put in by later investors. The SEC further alleges that approximately $16.1 million was diverted to personal use. The store where a 9-year-old kid once built a crystal radio on his bedroom floor was now a line item in a fraud complaint. The chief operating officer had been described on the company website as having over a decade of experience managing multi-million-dollar businesses. The SEC complaint described her background differently. As of March 2026, they are still fighting it out in court. The RadioShack name now belongs to Unicomer Group, a retail company headquartered in El Salvador that has been running RadioShack franchise stores in Latin America since 1998. There is a man somewhere right now, probably in his late 60s, who has a suitcase in his garage full of RadioShack parts, resistors, capacitors, little toggle switches, alligator clips. Sometimes he opens it up and pours the parts out on his workbench. Not to build anything, just to hold them, just to look at something that still makes sense in his hands. If that man is you, tell me what's in your box. The store is gone, the wall is gone, and so is the guy behind the counter who knew everything. The company that taught that man how electricity worked collected his home address, sold it to a hedge fund, and put a crypto token where the science fair kits used to be. If your dad took you to RadioShack on Saturday mornings, you already know why this one hurts. Next time, we're walking into a Kmart. And the man who killed that one had a name too.